I used to love winter nights, until the snow began whispering beneath my floorboard. It started subtly, almost unnoticeable. A strange chill would settle in the cabin, despite the fireplace crackling steadily. I had only moved into the place a month earlier, tucked away in the remote mountains of upstate, seeking peace from the noise and chaos of the city. The locals called it old miners' land, but I thought that was just folklore. The first time I noticed something off was during a particularly bitter March night. I had just finished reading and climbed into bed, the wind howling softly outside. As I lay there, wrapped in layers of wool, I heard a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A light dragging noise from beneath the floorboards. At first, I chalked it up to old wood creaking, or perhaps a mouse scurrying beneath. But then came the whispering. It wasn't words, not at first, just a low murmur, like breath caught between frozen lips. It came and went in waves, barely audible over the wind, but enough to keep me wide-eyed in the darkness. I told myself I was just adjusting to the silence of solitude. I had always lived around noise, cars, conversations, phones ringing. Maybe this was just my mind filling the quiet. But then the frost trails started appearing. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw a delicate streak of frost curled across the wooden floor, like a slug's trail made of ice. I rubbed it with my sock, thinking maybe it had drifted in through a crack near the door. But more kept appearing. Each morning, a new trail, sometimes shaped like a handprint, other times like long fingers dragging across the boards. I checked for leaks, drafts, animals, nothing. I even sealed the windows tighter and insulated the walls more, but it didn't help. The cold seemed to be blooming from within the house itself. A week later, I woke up gasping for air, my lungs raw with cold. My breath clouded the room like smoke, though the fireplace was still glowing red. And then I heard it again, tap, 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 from beneath my bed. I stared at the floor, heart pounding, unsure whether to move or not. Eventually, I gathered enough nerve to kneel and look under the bed. There was nothing, but in the middle of the wooden floor beneath, I saw it. Another frost ring, perfectly circular, a patch of rime ice that hadn't been there before. As I stared at it, I swore. I could feel something watching me through the floor. That night, I had a dream, or what I thought was. I was standing waist deep in snow, unable to move, frost creeping up my legs. The wind screamed around me, and a figure stood in the distance, a gaunt silhouette, draped in tattered workwear, face half consumed by frostbite. It stared at me without eyes and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I woke up soaked in sweat, my hands blistered with red patches, frostburn, but there was no explanation. I hadn't even left my bed. I decided to ask around in the nearby town the next time I went for supplies. When I brought it up casually to the old man at the general store, he looked at me like I'd said something forbidden. "That house doesn't keep heat," he said, "because it keeps something else." I didn't know how to respond. He wouldn't say more, only muttered something about the cabin being built over an old mining tunnel. Said there'd been a cave-in decades ago, right beneath that spot. Some miners were never recovered. People who stayed in that house heard things, saw things. Most left before the first snowfall melted. I tried to brush it off. I wasn't superstitious. But back at the cabin, everything felt worse. The cold grew sharper. The whispers turned to voices, clearer now. Sometimes a woman weeping. Sometimes a man breathing heavily. Sometimes just a chorus of murmuring beneath my feet, echoing through the floor like wind through a hollow grave. One evening, I noticed something strange near the fireplace, a cluster of frost forming a strange symbol on the wall, a circle surrounded by jagged lines, almost like some kind of ancient rune. I tried wiping it away, but the pattern returned by morning, colder and sharper than before. Soon, the cold wasn't just a sensation, it was alive. My pantry froze. The mirror fogged constantly from inside. My body ached with cold even when I sat by the fire. I began seeing things in the corner of my vision, shadows that flickered and vanished when I turned. One night, I caught a reflection in the mirror, a face behind me pale and eyeless, lips trembling as if trying to speak. I couldn't take it anymore. I tore up part of the floor where the cold seemed to concentrate. Beneath the boards, I found a crawl space I never knew existed. I don't know what compelled me to go down there, but I had to. I needed to understand what was happening. I brought a flashlight and crawled inside. The space was cramped, the air thick with rot and frost. Old tools lay scattered, rusted beyond recognition. And then I saw it. A corpse, half mummified, half frozen, curled in the corner, with its mouth gaping in a frozen scream. Around the body were markings, symbols carved into the wood, identical to the ones forming on the walls upstairs. As I stared, I felt the temperature plummet. My flashlight flickered. I heard whispering right in my ear, soft, intimate, like breath brushing my skin. And then the corpse twitched. I scrambled out, heart hammering, nearly breaking my ankle in the process. I sealed the crawl space, boarded it shut, tried to forget what I'd seen, but the house didn't let me. Now, the voices spoke my name. The walls sweated frost. I woke up with scratches down my back and deep bruises in the shape of fingers. One night, during a heavy blizzard, everything culminated. The wind was deafening, but I heard the floor cracking. Something was burrowing upward. I saw the wood splinter, frost rising like smoke. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Ice sealed it shut from the inside. I ran from room to room, but every window was layered in thick frost, like someone had smeared ice across them with their palms. The fireplace died out instantly. The air turned sharp, like breathing razors. The whispers became screams. Dozens of hands burst from the floorboards, white, bony, frostbitten, grabbing at me. They pulled at my clothes, my legs, my arms, dragging me downward. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. The cold consumed everything. Darkness swallowed me. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the snow, outside the ruins of the cabin. My skin was raw with frostbite, my clothes shredded. A rescue crew found me days later, half delirious. But there was no crawl space, no corpse, nothing under the cabin, just snow-covered rubble. I've tried to move on, but every winter, it returns. Sometime on cold nights, I still hear the tapping under my apartment, and I don't go looking. Some things beneath the ice should stay buried. I was house-sitting for my cousin when the knocking began. She lived in a quiet town nestled deep in the woods, where the roads became sheets of ice and snowbanks stood like walls through most of March. I'd stayed at her place a few times before, but this time was different. She and her husband had gone on a last-minute trip to Florida, and I agreed to watch their place for a week. Feed the cat, keep the fireplace going, nothing unusual. It was the third night when things started to feel off. I woke up to a soft knock at the back door. Not loud, just 3 steady knocks. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I figured maybe the wind had blown something against it. But when I peeked out through the window, there were footprints, fresh in the deep snow, leading from the tree line directly to the door. But no one was there. The snow was falling heavily that night, thick, wet flakes that covered everything within minutes. If someone had been there, their tracks should have already started fading. But these were sharp, crisp, as if they'd been made just seconds before. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a fire poker, barely blinking. The next day, I asked a neighbor about it, an older woman who lived 2 houses down. When I mentioned the footprints, she stared at me for a moment, then gave a weak smile. "You must have heard about the snow knocker." I shook my head. "Just an old story," she said. "Kids used to dare each other to stay up and listen for it. They said when the snow's heavy enough and you hear knocking in the middle of the night, you don't open the door, no matter what." I tried to laugh it off. Just local folklore, right? Like any other small-town myth. But the way she looked at me, I could tell she believed it. That night, it happened again. 3 knocks, this time at the front door. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see more footprints. I just sat in the armchair by the fireplace and waited for it to stop, but it didn't. The knocking came again, slower this time, like the visitor was testing the wood, almost playful. Then the cat started growling. It didn't meow or hiss, just this deep, low growl I'd never heard before. It was staring at the hallway, like something was moving there, but I hadn't heard anything inside the house. I walked slowly down the hallway, every board creaking beneath me. The air felt colder, like something had seeped in through the walls. The thermostat was still at 70, but my breath fogged in the air. I checked every room. Nothing. But as I was heading back toward the living room, I passed by the full-length mirror in the hallway, and I stopped cold. There was something standing behind me. I turned around instantly. Nothing there. But in the mirror, for a split second, I saw it again. A tall figure, no detail, just a shadow, standing perfectly still behind me, closer than anyone should ever be. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the footprints were back, this time circling the house, around and around, like someone had paced the perimeter for hours. I even took a photo to prove I wasn't going crazy. But when I checked my phone later, the image was gone, deleted. I hadn't touched it. That evening, I tried to convince myself I was just paranoid. Maybe the isolation was messing with me. Maybe it was just a prank. I made tea, lit more logs in the fireplace, tried to distract myself with a movie. But around midnight, the power cut out. Total silence, total darkness. And then came the knocking again. But this time, it wasn't from a door. It was from the window. I sat frozen in the living room as the knock repeated. This time, rhythmic. 5 taps, then silence. 5 more. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. There it was, a figure, standing inches from the glass, not moving, covered in frost and snow, like it had been standing there for hours. I couldn't see its face, just a vague outline. Too tall, too thin, like a person stretched out wrong. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. I closed the curtain and backed away, grabbing my phone. No signal, no Wi-Fi. I was completely cut off. The knocking didn't stop for hours. Eventually, it faded. I fell asleep near dawn, curled up in the armchair, wrapped in blankets with the cat pressed against me. But that wasn't the end. The final night, I decided to stay awake and record everything. I kept the camera on, pointed toward the window, with a flashlight ready in case the knocking started again. It did, but this time, I saw something I can never unsee. When the knocking began, I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. There was no figure there, but in the beam of light, I saw the frost forming on the glass. It was moving, like fingers, drawing shapes, symbols I didn't recognize. And then, the mirror in the hallway shattered. I ran to it. No idea why, just instinct. The cat was screaming now, yowling like it was being hurt. When I turned the corner, I saw the mirror had cracked completely. But it wasn't just broken. There was something inside it. A face, pressed against the other side of the mirror, frozen in place, eyes wide and mouth open in an eternal scream. And it wasn't a stranger's face. It was mine. I left the house that night, walked 2 miles in the snow to the neighbor's place, and begged for help. When I came back the next day with the sheriff, everything looked untouched. No shattered mirror, no footprints, no frost, nothing. My cousin still thinks I had a breakdown from the isolation, but I know what I saw. Every winter since then, I hear it. Just past midnight, when the snow's heavy and the wind stills. Knock, knock, knock. And I never look at the windows anymore. It was the coldest March night I could remember, the kind that makes your skin sting just stepping outside for a second. I was staying in my late grandfather's old cabin, tucked away in the pine-covered hills of northern Maine. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a way to clear my head after a rough breakup and a string of sleepless nights. I thought isolation would bring me peace. I was wrong. The cabin was old, creaky, and half buried under a thick blanket of snow. Still, there was a strange comfort in its rustic charm. Wooden beams, faded photographs, an old stone fireplace that crackled softly every evening. I spent my first 2 days chopping firewood, reading, and watching the snow fall through frosted windows. The silence was deafening but oddly soothing. On the third night, I noticed something odd. There were wet footprints on the wooden floor near the back door. Bare footprints, human. Just 5 of them, leading from the door toward the kitchen, then stopping abruptly. I stared at them for a long time, heart pounding. I hadn't left the door open. I hadn't walked barefoot anywhere, and they weren't mine. They were too large. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, even checked the crawl space. Nothing. No broken locks, no open windows, nothing stolen or out of place. I told myself, maybe it was a dream. Maybe I spilled water and my mind just filled in the rest. I forced myself to forget about it. But the next night they returned. More footprints. This time, leading from the kitchen into the hallway toward the bedroom. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable. A sharp, earthy rot, like something decaying in the walls. I tore through the place looking for the source, but there was nothing. Still, the stench clung to the air, thick and cloying. Later that night, I woke up in a cold sweat. The fire had gone out, and I could see my breath. But worse than the cold was the sound. A low, wet dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. It came from the kitchen. I sat up, clutching the blanket, listening. Drag, pause, drag. Then it stopped. I mustered the courage to tiptoe to the bedroom door and peek out. Nothing. The cabin was still, but I knew it had been there, whatever it was. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I packed my things and called a local tow service to come pull my car out. Its battery had died from the cold, and the snow made the road impassable, but they said they wouldn't be able to make it for another 2 days. I was stuck. The isolation no longer felt peaceful. It felt oppressive, like the trees were leaning in closer, watching, like the shadows in the corners of the cabin were thicker than they should have been. That night, I locked every door, every window, and stacked firewood against the front and back entrance. I even nailed boards across the bedroom door. I was desperate. But around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound. Only this time, it was right outside my bedroom. I held my breath. The boards I'd nailed up were trembling. Something was pressing against the door, slow and deliberate. Then came the whispering. A voice low and raspy, murmuring something I couldn't make out. It didn't sound like English or like anything human. I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. The cat, my grandfather's old gray tabby who'd been with me since I arrived, bolted under the bed, hissing violently. Then the boards cracked. Not broken, just bent outward, like whatever was outside was stronger than it should have been. I pressed myself into the corner, clutching a fire poker, heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. But after a few minutes, the pressure stopped. I waited until dawn before moving. When I finally opened the door, the boards were splintered, and the floor was covered in what looked like wet sludge, thick, black, and stinking of rot. I followed the trail with trembling steps all the way back to the kitchen. There, on the counter, was something I hadn't seen in years: my grandfather's hunting knife, clean, sharpened, laid out neatly on a blood-stained cloth. He'd died in that cabin, collapsed one winter while alone, unable to call for help. I found him days later when I was just a teenager, but now it felt like something of him, something bitter, angry, or maybe something else entirely had moved in after he passed. I didn't sleep the night. I sat by the fireplace with the knife in one hand and my eyes on the door, but nothing came. When the tow service finally arrived, I didn't even lock the cabin behind me. I just left. I didn't say anything. I didn't look back. I sometimes dream of those footprints now, wet, bare, heavy, moving closer to my bed, and I still don't know what would have happened if that door had finally given in. It started with the wind, that relentless, shrieking wind that clawed at the windows like it was trying to get inside. I'd rented a small winter cabin deep in the outskirts of Vermont, hoping for a peaceful, snowy retreat away from the stress of work and life. I thought solitude would help me reset, just me, the snow, and silence. But the silence never came. From the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The place was charming enough: wood-paneled walls, an old brick chimney, snow-laden pine trees surrounding it like a frozen cocoon. But there was a weight in the air, a heaviness, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The first night, I barely slept. The wind howled all night, and I kept hearing this faint, clicking sound, like fingernails tapping against glass. I checked every window, every door. Nothing. I chalked it up to branches brushing the roof or my own nerves. But the next morning, I found scratches on the glass of the bedroom window, thin, precise lines, like claws. I told myself it had to be the wind-driven tree branch. Nothing else made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That feeling only deepened as the day wore on. The trees looked closer to the cabin than they had before, and every time I turned my back, I felt like something had shifted just out of sight. I was making tea in the evening when I heard it again. Click, click, click. I turned and saw it. Something standing behind the window in the living room. Just for a split second, a silhouette, slender, unmoving, then gone. I raced outside, heart pounding, thinking maybe someone was out there messing with me. But there were no footprints in the snow. Not a single one. The snow was untouched, smooth as silk. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The clicking came back, louder, faster, and then it moved to the back door. Tap, tap, tap. The doorknob jiggled slightly just once, like someone was testing it. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it through the glass. There was nothing there, but when I looked down at the doorknob, I saw smudges, long, oily fingerprints, far too long to be human. The smears curved oddly, like the fingers had too many joints. I started pacing, debating whether to leave, but the snowstorm was intensifying, and my car was buried under several feet of snow. I had no cell signal. I was trapped. I tried to distract myself with music, movies, anything, but sometime after midnight, I heard something worse than the tapping. Whispers. They came from inside the cabin. I paused my music and strained to listen. The voices were low, wet-sounding, like someone was speaking underwater. They came from the walls, like they were crawling through the wood itself. And then I saw the hallway light flicker. I crept closer, heart racing. The air turned colder with every step. The bulb above the hallway door buzzed, flickered again, then blew out completely. I stood there in the dim light from the fireplace, staring at the shadows shifting across the walls. And then I saw it again, the silhouette. Only this time it was inside the cabin. It moved unnaturally, jerky, twitching motions like it didn't quite understand how to use a body. Its limbs were too long, its head tilting sharply to one side like it was listening. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then it turned toward me. I ran. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it with a chair. I could hear it pacing on the other side, dragging its limbs across the floor, clicking its claws along the walls like it was searching. The whispers returned louder now, desperate, like a chant spoken backwards. I hid in the bathroom, crouched in the tub with the door locked, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Hours passed. The noises faded. I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion. In the morning, everything looked normal again. The scratches on the windows were gone, the smudges on the doorknob, gone. No signs of anything unusual, just snow, silent. I convinced myself it was a dream. Maybe a vivid hallucination from stress and sleep deprivation. Until I found the note. It was under my pillow. A piece of parchment, aged and yellowed. The handwriting was spidery, shaky. Just 6 words. Let me in next time, please. I left the cabin that same hour. Even though the roads were still covered in snow, I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But sometimes, when the wind howls outside my apartment and I hear a faint tapping at my window, I wonder, did I really leave it behind? I've always loved winter. The stillness, the snow-covered streets, the way everything slows down and feels quieter, safer somehow. But that changed last March, on a night so cold and strange, I still can't talk about it without shivering. It happened when I visited my aunt's house in a small town nestled in the hills of Pennsylvania. She was out of the country for a few weeks and had asked me to house sit. The place was old but cozy. A Victorian home with creaky wooden floors, thick velvet curtains, and that odd, comforting scent of aged furniture and burning firewood. I arrived just as a snowstorm started rolling in. The first couple of days were uneventful. I read books by the fireplace, watched snow drift past the windows, and enjoyed the isolation. But then came the fifth night. That's when I first heard the knocking. It started just after midnight. A faint, slow knock on the front door, 3 times, spaced out. I paused, unsure if I'd imagined it. I peeked outside, but the snow was falling hard, and the porch light barely cut through the swirling white. There was no one there, and not a single footprint in the freshly fallen snow. Weird, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was ice shifting on the roof, or a branch against the siding. The next night, the knocking came again. Same time, same 3 knocks, but this time, it was louder, more deliberate. I checked again, nothing. No prints, no signs of anyone. I started feeling uneasy. Something about the rhythm of the knocks felt wrong. Too slow, too patient. Like whoever was doing it wasn't trying to get inside, just trying to let me know they were there. By the 7th night, I was on edge. I kept the lights on, phone in hand, and waited. Sure enough, 12:03 a.m., 3 knocks, then silence. I stayed up the whole night, watching from the window. The snow was deep now, nearly covering the steps, yet not a single mark disturbed the surface. The next day, I noticed something strange in the backyard, a shape under the snow. I grabbed a shovel and started digging. About 2 feet down, I hit something solid, wood. It was a small door, a trapdoor, half buried beneath years of soil and snow. There were no markings, no handles, just a rusted iron latch. It didn't make sense. My aunt had never mentioned anything about it. The house didn't even have a basement. Curiosity got the best of me. I pried it open. Beneath it was a narrow set of stone stairs leading into pitch-black darkness. The air that escaped was freezing and foul. Wet earth, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. I couldn't see much beyond the first few steps, so I closed it back up and tried to forget about it. But that night, the knocking came again. Only this time, it wasn't at the front door. It came from beneath the floor. I froze, heart thudding. The sound was faint, muffled, like knuckles tapping from below the floorboards in the living room. I stood there staring at the rug and listened. 3 knocks. Then, silent. I barely slept. I tried to call my aunt the next morning, but her number went straight to voicemail. I even called a neighbor she was friends with, but they hadn't heard from her in over a week. Something felt very wrong. Later that day, I noticed something else. The rug in the living room had shifted slightly, revealing a square outline in the wood beneath it. Another door. I pulled the rug back completely. It was a hatch. My pulse quickened. I hesitated, then opened it. Another ladder descended into the same darkness as the trapdoor outside. It connected. I stood at the top of the ladder, peering down into the black. I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, like someone had ducked into the shadows. I slammed it shut and locked it, but I couldn't stop thinking of it. Something lived down there, something that knocked every night, and I'd let it know I'd found its door. That night, the knocking came again, this time louder. Not 3 knocks, 10. Rapid, aggressive. I backed away from the hatch, clutching a kitchen knife, barely able to breathe. Then it stopped. I thought it was over. But then came the whispering, soft, desperate, just beneath the... Let me out! I ran to the backyard, grabbed the shovel, and buried the outside trapdoor under feet of snow and dirt. I didn't want to know what was beneath that house. I didn't care anymore. I packed my things the next morning and left, driving straight through the snowstorm to get home. I never spoke to my aunt about it, not even after she returned weeks later. She said everything was fine. No strange noises, no doors under the rug, nothing unusual. But she started looking tired, pale, jumpy, like she wasn't sleeping well. Sometimes, when I call her, I can hear faint tapping sounds in the background. 3 knocks, then silence. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a weekend getaway to clear my mind and breathe some fresh mountain air before work swallowed me. I booked a tiny Airbnb cabin tucked deep in the woods of Colorado, surrounded by snowy peaks and silent. The pictures looked cozy, a fireplace, a warm bed, a little porch facing the forest. perfect solitude. But from the moment I got there, something felt off. The key was under the mat, just like the host had said. The cabin was clean, warm, almost too perfect. It was eerily quiet. I remember thinking, where are the birds? The wind? Even the snow falling outside made no sound, as if it was afraid to disturb whatever was watching from the woods. I told myself I was just being dramatic. I'd been overworked, my mind frayed. But that first night, I noticed something strange. The mirror in the hallway. It didn't reflect right. I don't know how else to describe it. When I passed it, I'd see my reflection out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look directly, I'd be slightly off. My head would tilt differently or my eyes wouldn't move with mine. I blamed it on the old glass. Maybe it was warped, like antique mirrors sometimes. But on the second night, it did something else. I was brushing my teeth when I passed by the mirror. I glanced at it, just a habit, and froze. My reflection was standing still. I had moved. It hadn't. Just stood there, staring at me, mouth slightly open, like it was caught mid-breath. My heart dropped. I stepped back, then forward again. Nothing. The moment I blinked, the reflection caught up, moving perfectly in sync again as if it had never glitched. I didn't sleep that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside the cabin, slow, crunching footfalls through the snow. I peeked out the window. There was someone out there, a figure standing at the tree line, tall and still. It wasn't moving, just watching. I grabbed my phone, no signal. I wanted to believe it was a lost hiker, maybe a neighbor from another cabin. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something about the way it stood, the impossibly still posture, the way its head tilted just slightly, like it was listening, felt wrong, animalistic. It vanished into the trees after a few minutes, but I couldn't stop shaking. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow leading right up to the front door, but none leading away. And that night, it came closer. I heard tapping at the window around midnight. Not knocking, tapping. Gentle, rhythmic. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. I pulled the curtain aside just a crack. It was my reflection. Outside the window in the snow stood a perfect replica of me. Same clothes, same posture. But it wasn't breathing. Its skin looked pale and waxy like a mannequin. It just stood there, tapping its fingers on the glass while staring at me in a motionless expression. I backed away slowly, heart in my throat. The lights flickered. I turned back toward the mirror in the hallway, and it was empty. No reflection, just an empty hallway in the mirror, while I stood directly in front of it. I moved my hand, but nothing showed. Then, a second later, something else stepped into view in the reflection. Something that wasn't me. It was the copy, the thing from outside, and it was smiling. I ran into the bedroom, locked the door, and curled up with a blanket, watching the hallway from under the doorframe. I heard footsteps, soft and slow, approaching. Then the doorknob twisted, once, twice, then stopped, silent. The next morning, everything was back to normal. My reflection had returned. The tracks outside were gone. No signs of anyone, nothing out of place. I packed my things and left without even brushing my teeth. When I got home, I avoided mirrors for days. Eventually, I had to look again. Just a quick glance to reassure myself. But sometimes, when I pass a mirror now, I catch a delay, just for a split second, like it's still trying to remember how to be me. I've never been superstitious. Ghost stories, cursed objects, urban legends. They were just fun things to read, nothing more. That changed the winter I took a job at a small antique store in a quiet mountain town. I needed money, and the owner, Mr. Elbridge, seemed harmless enough. An old man with a crooked spine and a stare that lingered just a little too long. The store itself was ancient. Cluttered shelves, dusty glass cabinets, dim yellow lights. Every item had a story, Elbridge would say, usually with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't believe in any of it, at least not until I found the music box. It was buried in a pile of junk in the back room, wrapped in moth-eaten fabric. A small, ornate wooden box with silver etchings and a cracked porcelain ballerina on top. I wound it out of curiosity, expecting some off-key lullaby, but no sound came out, just the ballerina spinning slowly in silence. I showed it to Elbridge. He went pale the second he saw it. "Don't touch it again," he said quietly, snatching it from my hands and locking it in a drawer behind the counter. "It doesn't belong to us." I thought he was just being overly dramatic, but that night I heard music in my apartment, software, hollow, the kind of melody that would make your skin crawl even if it were coming from a child's toy. I checked everywhere, radio, phone, TV, nothing, just silence. Until I went to bed and heard it again, faintly. It was playing through the walls. When I got back to the shop the next morning, I saw the music box sitting on the counter. The drawer where it had been locked was wide open, and Elbridge was nowhere to be seen. I called his name, nothing. I checked the back room, nothing. I waited all day, but he never showed up. That night, the music played again, louder this time. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ballerina spinning, her cracked face slowly turning toward me, like she was watching me from inside my head. The next day, I returned the box to the drawer and locked it myself. But when I turned around, it was back on the counter. I was starting to feel insane. I stopped sleeping altogether. I kept hearing footsteps in my apartment, whispers when the wind blew through the cracks in the window. One night, I woke up and found a small porcelain hand on my nightstand, identical to the ballerina's. It hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I didn't go back to the store after that. I tried quitting, but Elbridge never answered my calls. I even went by the shop, but the windows were boarded up and a sign hung on the door, closed indefinite. Then, a week later, I received a package at my door. No return address, just a brown box, slightly damp, with a faint scent of dust and old wood. Inside was the music box, and a note that simply read, "She likes you." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't destroy it. I tried. I burned it in my fireplace, smashed it with a hammer, even buried it in a frozen field outside town. But it always came back. Always. Now, every night without fail, the music starts around 12:15 a.m., and I see her, spinning slowly in the corner of the room, her broken porcelain face turning toward me as that haunting melody echoes through the dark. Sometimes she stops spinning. Sometimes she just stands there. And every night, she's a little closer. I was never afraid of winter. I loved the cold, the crisp air, the way snow made everything look pure and untouched. But after what happened last year, I can't look at a winter night the same way again. It started when I took a job as a nighttime caretaker for an old abandoned lodge deep in the mountains. The owners were trying to renovate it for the next tourist season, but until then, they needed someone to watch over the property. It seemed easy enough. Stay inside, keep the fireplace going, check the doors and windows, and report anything suspicious. The first few nights were peaceful. The wind howled outside, the snow piled up, but inside the fire was warm, and I had my books and radio. The lodge itself was beautiful, even if it was a bit eerie. Dusty chandeliers, long empty hallways, and rooms that hadn't been used in decades. But on the fourth night, I started noticing strange things. At first, it was just footprints in the snow. I'd do my usual rounds before bed, checking the property, and I'd see them. Deep, precise footprints leading up to the lodge. Always just one set. Always stopping at the front steps. No one ever knocked. No one ever entered. And when I opened the door, there was nothing but the endless white silence of the snow-covered forest. Then, the knocking started. It would come around 2 a.m., 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. The first time, I thought it was a lost traveler. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled the heavy door open, and shone the beam into the cold. Nothing. Just untouched snow. The footprints were gone. The second night, the knocking came again. Louder. More urgent. I ran to the door and flung it open. Still nothing. But when I looked down, there they were. Footprints in the fresh snow. Bare footprints, leading from the woods to my door. Who the hell walks barefoot in the snow? I locked the doors, barricaded myself in the main hall, and kept the fire burning. Sleep was impossible. Every hour, I swore I heard faint shuffling outside. The wind whispered through the cracks in the windows like it was trying to tell me something. On the sixth night, I saw it. I was staring out from the second-floor window, watching the snow fall, when I noticed a figure at the edge of the tree line, not moving, just standing there. A tall, thin shape with hollowed-out eyes and a twisted grin. Its skin was pale, almost blue, and it looked stretched too tight over its face. It lifted one hand, raised a single finger to its lips, shh, then turned and vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. The knocking came again at 2 a.m., but this time, I didn't open the door. I just sat by the fire, listening. Then I heard it, the creak of floorboards upstairs. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the fire poke and crept up the staircase, heart pounding. The lodge was silent, but as I turned the corner into the hallway, I saw something impossible. The attic door was open. I had never opened. Inside, there was only darkness, cold, endless darkness, and from within it, something whispered my name. I ran. I don't remember locking the door. I don't remember grabbing my coat. I just remember sprinting into the night, through the snow, away from that cursed lodge. I made it back to town by morning, frostbitten and half mad with fear. The owners called me the next day. They sounded confused. "Why'd you leave so suddenly?" the woman asked. "We sent someone up to check on you, but the lodge was locked up tight. It looked like no one had been there in months." That wasn't possible. But when I went back with them, everything was exactly as they said. Dust-covered furniture, an untouched fireplace, no footprints in the snow. The attic door was shut, nailed closed. My things were gone as if I'd never even stayed there. I don't know what happened in that place, but sometimes, on cold winter nights, I wake up to knocking on my door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and I know deep down that if I ever open it, if I ever let it in, it won't let me leave again. I used to love taking long winter drives. There was something calming about snow-covered roads winding through the countryside, especially when everything was quiet and still. It made me feel like the world had hit pause. No chaos, no noise, just solitude. That night I was driving home from visiting my sister in a nearby town. It was late, past midnight, and the snow had just started falling. The road ahead was empty, not a single car in sight. The only sound was the hum of my tires against the icy asphalt and the soft swish of flakes hitting the window. I was about 40 minutes from home when I saw her, a woman standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. She wore a long, tattered gray coat, her black hair soaked from the snow. Her head tilted slightly down, like she was shivering. I slowed down, unsure if I should stop. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She didn't wave, didn't signal for help, just stood there in the cold. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. I rolled down the passenger window slightly and called out, "Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Slowly, she raised her head. Her face was pale, unnaturally pale, and her eyes were wide, hollow, almost too large for her face. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. I unlocked the door and hesitated. Before I could offer a ride, she reached for the handle and opened it herself. She didn't say a word, just sat down silently, her coat soaked and her skin nearly bluish from the cold. I tried to make small talk, asked where she was headed. No response. She just stared ahead, hands folded in her lap, lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Her breath didn't fog the window. I told myself she was in shock, maybe lost or suffering from hypothermia. I kept driving, glancing at her every few minutes. She never blinked, never moved. After 10 minutes, I asked again, "Where are you going?" Still nothing. I turned to look at her fully, and she was gone. The seat was empty. The door was still closed. No sign she'd ever been there. But the seat was wet. Her footprints were on the floor mat. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, staring at the passenger seat in disbelief. I told myself I was overtired, that I'd imagined her. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. She was in the back seat. I didn't even hear her move. Her eyes were fixed on me, that same hollow, wide-eyed stare. Her mouth slowly began to open, wider than it should have, like her jaw was unhinging. And then she whispered something I still hear in my nightmares. "Don't leave me." I swerved off the road. The car hit a snowbank and skidded into a ditch. When I scrambled out, there was no one in the car, no woman, no footprints in the snow, just the wet imprint on the seat and a whisper echoing in my head. The tow truck driver arrived an hour later. I asked him if he'd ever seen anyone like her out here. He nodded slowly. "Every winter. They call her the cold passenger. Folks say she died on this road decades ago. Walked for hours in a storm, looking for help. No one ever stopped. Now she waits, hoping someone finally takes her home. I don't drive at night anymore. And if I ever see anyone on the side of a snowy road again, I'll keep driving. Because once she gets in your car, she never really leaves." I'd been working as a snowplow driver for over 12 years, and nothing ever truly shook me until that night in March, when the storm rolled in harder than anything I'd seen in my life. It was just after midnight, and the roads outside our small town were buried in a thick blanket of snow. The wind howled, rattling the plow's windows, and visibility was barely a few feet ahead. I was halfway through my route along the forest road, an old, winding stretch that hadn't been used much since the highway was. The area always gave me the creeps. Tall, black trees pressed up against the road like silent watchers, and the snow swallowed every sound, leaving only the engine's growl and the rhythmic scrape of the blade. But that night, something felt different. About 3 miles in, I spotted something strange. There were footprints in the snow, barefoot. They ran alongside the road slightly ahead of where I was plowing. No shoes, no socks, just bare human feet. In the middle of a snowstorm. My first thought was that someone had wandered from a wrecked vehicle and was lost out here, maybe suffering from frostbite or hypothermia. I slowed the plow and followed the prints with my eyes as it weaved off into the trees. Then a hand slapped against my windshield. I hit the brakes hard. A woman stood in front of the plow, inches from the blade, her face pale and streaked with ice, eyes wide and vacant. Her mouth moved, but I couldn't hear a sound. I jumped out of the cab, yelling over the wind, but she didn't respond. She just kept mouthing something over and over again. I approached cautiously. She collapsed. I rushed over and tried to lift her, but when I touched her, she was ice cold, far colder than the air around us. Her skin felt brittle, and then I realized she wasn't breathing. I staggered back, heart racing. I was about to run for my radio when I turned to look at her again, and she was gone. No footprints, no body, just the snow swirling in circles where she'd been standing. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I reported it to the sheriff, thinking maybe I'd hallucinated from lack of sleep. But he looked at me strangely and said, You saw her too, huh? Apparently, I wasn't the first. According to him, every few winters, someone sees the same woman, barefoot, lost, silent. Sometimes she appears in the road. Sometimes people find her standing by the tree line. There's never a body, never a missing persons report. Just that figure in the storm. The locals call her the Snow Widow. The story goes that decades ago, a woman's husband took that very road to fetch help when their car broke down in a storm. He never came back. She tried to find him, barefoot, desperate, and froze to death out. People say her spirit still walks the road looking for him, still mouthing his name, still waiting. I didn't believe it until a week later, when I found something on the road while plowing again. A wedding ring, half buried in fresh snow, still warm to the touch. I never told anyone about that part, but every time I drive that stretch now, I feel her, watching from the trees, waiting for someone to stop. And sometimes I hear the sound of bare feet crunching snow just outside my cab, even when there's no one there. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I'd rented a cabin deep in the woods to get away from everything. No phone calls, no work emails, just me, a stack of books, and the stillness of late winter. March in those parts was brutal. Snow piled high, nights colder than the grave, but I liked it that way. The solitude helped me breathe again. The cabin was old but charming. A creaky porch, a stone fireplace, thick wooden walls that smelled of pine and smoke. There was a narrow trail leading out to a frozen lake, and beyond that, nothing but forest for miles. It felt like I was the only person alive out there. The first night passed quietly. The fire crackled, the wind whistled softly outside, and I fell asleep to the sound of snow tapping gently on the windows. The second night, something changed. I woke up just after 3 a.m., drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature. The fire had long gone out and the cabin felt unnaturally cold, like the air had been sucked out of it. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, unable to explain the overwhelming feeling of dread pressing down on me. That's when I heard the knocking. 3 slow knocks. Not on the front door, but on the back window. I froze. The bedroom window looked out into the woods, and it was nearly impossible for anyone to get there without leaving deep tracks in the snow. But when I peeked through the curtain, there were no footprints, just a faint imprint on the glass, like a hand had pressed against it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside to check. No prints, no sign of anyone. I convinced myself it had been a tree branch in the wind, that maybe I'd dreamt it. But when I came back in, there was something sitting on the doorstep, a small handmade doll, crude, wrapped in twine, its face drawn on with something dark, smeared like ash or dried blood. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to throw it or burn it. In the end, I left it on the porch and tried to shake it off. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it came from both sides of the cabin. Front door, back window, then the side wall. The rhythm was slow, deliberate. Knock, 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 like someone circling the house. When I looked outside again, I saw them. Figures in the tree line. 3, maybe 4 of them. Barely visible, standing completely still, almost blending into the dark pines. I couldn't see faces, only silhouettes. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. I locked every door and window, shoved furniture against the frames, and huddled in the corner with the fire poker. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, they were gone. No tracks, no sign they'd ever been there. But the doll on the porch had changed. Its head was torn off. I left that afternoon, packed everything and got in the car. Didn't even bother to clean up. The snowstorm was already rolling in and I didn't care. I just needed to get out. But as I drove down the trail leading back to the main road, I saw something that nearly made me crash. More dolls, hanging from tree branches on both sides of the trail. Dozens of them, all crudely made, all facing the direction of the cabin. Some had no heads. Some had twigs jammed through their eyes or chests. It was like a warning or a ritual. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, I still hear the knocking in my dreams. 3 slow knocks. And when I wake up, I swear I see handprints on my bedroom window. It was my first winter in the new house. I just moved into a small 2-story cottage nestled near the edge of a quiet rural town. It was the kind of place I'd always dreamed of. Snow-covered hills, thick woods in the distance, and a peaceful silence you could never find in the city. I wanted solitude, a fresh start, and the promise of peace. I didn't realize how dangerous silence could become until it was all I could hear. Everything felt perfect. The house was old but cozy, with a fireplace that gave off a comforting glow and a large window that overlooked the forest. It was the kind of home where you could imagine living out your days in quiet contentment. But that first week, I started hearing things. It began subtly, faint creaking in the floorboards at night, soft, rustling like something brushing against the outside walls. I told myself it was just the house settling or wind against the siding. But then I started waking up at exactly 3:12 a.m. every night. Always 3:12. Every single time. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding for no reason, drenched in sweat even though the room was cold. Nothing seemed out of place until one night I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The attic door was open. It had been shut since I moved in. I was sure of it. I even had to use a step stool the first time I checked it, just to make sure there were no rats or birds. But now it hung slightly ajar, just enough to cast a shadow on the hallway floor. I stood there, staring up at it in the dark, too scared to reach for the pull cord. Eventually, I convinced myself I must have left it that way, even though a part of me knew that wasn't true. The next day, I tried to shrug it off. I busied myself with chores, rearranged furniture, anything to keep my mind distracted. But that night, at 3:12 a.m., I woke again. This time, there were footsteps, not loud, just soft, slow, pacing directly above me, in the attic. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, frozen, listening to the slow drag of footsteps circling above my head. After what felt like hours, they stopped, and I could hear breathing right above me. I didn't go up to the attic. I couldn't. I just stayed in bed until the sun rose. When I finally mustered the courage to check, everything looked untouched. No signs of anyone up there, no footprints in the dust, nothing out of place. But later that day, I found something strange in the hallway. A long strand of hair, black, too long to be mine. I lived alone. That night, I bolted the attic shut, but it didn't stop the footsteps. Every night, the same routine, 3:12 a.m., footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate, circling. The breathing grew louder each time, like whatever was up there was inching closer to the hatch. I started sleeping downstairs on the couch, clutching a flashlight, too afraid to close my eyes. Then, one night, the sound changed. The footsteps came down the stairs. I didn't hear the hatch open. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The air got colder, heavier. I turned on every light, backed into the kitchen, and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. But I heard something behind me, a soft, scraping sound. When I turned, the hallway wall had something carved into it. 3 numbers, 3:12. That was the final straw. I packed a bag and drove to the nearest motel. I didn't go back for a week. When I finally did, it was to put the place up for sale. I just wanted to get out, forget it ever happened. But the real horror came later. The realtor called a few days after listing the house. She said one of her assistants had gone up to the attic to check the insulation and found something disturbing. A mattress, a pile of old clothes, and drawings, hundreds of crude, childlike drawings taped to the walls. All of them were of me, sleeping in bed, sitting on the couch, standing at the window. In every single one, a figure stood behind me, just tall enough to be hidden in the shadows, watching. I never stayed another night in that house. But even now, I wake up at 3:12 a.m., and I swear, I still hear the footsteps. Still hear the... I used to think the cold couldn't bother me. I grew up in northern winters, icy roads, frozen winds, snowdrifts as high as cars. I was used to it, but there's something different about the cold in isolation. Something deeper, something that gets into your bones in ways fire can't fix. I learned that the hard way when I took a job as a caretaker for an old, abandoned estate on the outskirts of town. The owner had died years ago, and his relatives were overseas. They just wanted someone to watch over the place through the winter, keep pipes from freezing, clear snow off the roof, basic maintenance. It sounded easy. Quiet work, good pay, a cozy place to stay for a couple months. The estate was beautiful, decaying. A wide 3-story house wrapped in a sagging veranda, surrounded by snow-covered trees and a rusted iron fence. The windows were tall and narrow, like watchful eyes, and inside, everything was thick with dust and shadows. Still, I liked it at first. It had character, a history, but it didn't take long before I realized I wasn't alone in that house. It started with the cold spot, not just chilly areas, bone-numbing zones that seemed to move. One corner of the upstairs hallway would drop to sub-zero temperatures in minutes, then vanish. You could see your breath like smoke in the middle of a warm room. I'd check the vents, the insulation. Nothing explained it. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, so soft I thought it was wind through cracks in the walls, but it wasn't. I'd walk past certain rooms and hear hushed voices behind closed doors. Never words, just breathy murmurs, like someone muttering secrets to themselves. One night, I pressed my ear to a door and heard something that chilled me more than the air ever could. Laughter, childlike, giggling. But there were no children anywhere near that place. None had ever lived there, according to the record. I tried to ignore it. I stopped going upstairs at night. I moved a space heater into the den and kept myself confined to a few rooms. But the house didn't like that. One night I woke to find all the doors open. Everyone I'd locked shut before bed. The basement door, which I never used, stood wide open, yawning into darkness. I shut it immediately and shoved a chair under the knob. But when I turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something in the snow outside the back door. Footprints, bare feet, small, leading from the woods to the house, but not away from it. I followed them outside with a flashlight. They stopped at the door, just stopped. No other marks, no indication of someone leaving. It was like they had entered but never exited. That night, I heard something moving upstairs again. Only this time, it was louder, heavier, like footsteps running back and forth. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with a crowbar in hand, heart pounding until everything went quiet. I didn't sleep. A few days later, while checking a pipe leak in the basement, I found a door I hadn't seen before, tucked behind an old shelf, almost sealed by cobwebs and rot. The wood was warped, the handle rusted, but curiosity got the better of me. I pried it open. It led to a narrow stone tunnel, not a storage room, a passage. Cold air wafted up from it like something breathing from the earth. I followed it, flashlight in hand, feet echoing on the stone floor. It twisted downward into the darkness, deeper and deeper, until I reached a small chamber at the end. There were drawings on the walls, scratched into the stone with nails or knives, childlike images, stick figures, people with hollow faces and hands, held up in fear. And in the center of the floor, something had been dug, a shallow pit filled with bones, small bones. I ran. I left everything behind, my gear, my clothes, even my wallet. I drove straight to town and never went back. When I tried to tell the family what I found, they brushed it off, said the house was old, superstitions, nothing more. But they sold it within weeks. Someone else lives there now. I wonder if they hear the laughter too. Sometimes on cold winter nights, I dream of that house, of the whispers behind the doors, of the footprints, and in the dream, I'm not alone. There's always a child standing in the hallway, staring at me through the darkness, smiling. I was never afraid of the woods. Growing up, I used to wander through them all the time, day or night, rain or snow. The forest felt like a second home, a place of silence and solitude where my mind could breathe. But everything changed last March, during the coldest week of the season, when I decided to spend a few nights in my family's old winter cabin. It was deep in the forest, far from any paved road. My grandfather had built it decades ago, a small one-room retreat with a wood-burning stove, a cot, and shelves filled with old books and tools. It had no electricity, no running water, but I loved it for that very reason. There was something peaceful about being cut off from the world. At least there used to be. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, snow tapped at the windows, but I felt safe wrapped in my sleeping bag by the fire. I fell asleep reading a book and didn't stir until morning. It was the second night when things began to feel off. I was chopping wood just before dusk when I saw something move between the trees. Just a flash, a pale blur ducking behind a trunk. I paused, axe raised, listening. Nothing. No sound, no crunch of snow, no animal scurrying off. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe even a trick of the light, but the feeling it left behind stuck with me. That night, the woods didn't feel peaceful. They felt watchful. I kept the fire going and tried to distract myself with a book, but I kept glancing at the window. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement out there, something just beyond the tree line. The snow was heavy, making it harder to see clearly, but I knew something was out there, watching. I finally convinced myself to sleep, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft, repetitive sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I froze. The fire had died down, so the cabin was nearly pitch black. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't wind or branches. It was deliberate. Fingertip. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. For a second, I thought I saw a face, pale with wide, empty eyes. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. I stayed up until dawn, axe in hand, staring at the door. The next morning, I went outside and circled the cabin. There were no footprints in the snow. None. No tracks at all. Nothing near the window. Nothing around the perimeter. Just untouched, freshly fallen snow. But something had tapped that glass. I should have left then. I should have packed up and hiked back to my truck. But curiosity kept me there, foolishly, stubbornly. That night, I barricaded the door, made sure every window was locked, and stacked extra wood in the fireplace to keep the cabin warm. But around midnight, the fire went out suddenly, completely, as if it had been snuffed out by a gust of wind. The cold rushed in instantly. I scrambled to relight it, but nothing worked. Matches wouldn't strike. The kindling wouldn't catch. The room grew colder by the second, and then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. only now it was on both windows. First the front, then the side, then the back. I tried not to look. I tried to stay calm, but something in me broke when I heard the front door handle jiggling. Slow, quiet, like someone testing it. And then the whispering began. Not words, just a low, inhuman hum that vibrated through the cabin walls. It was like 1,000 voices murmuring at once from inside the trees. I backed into the corner, clutching the axe, shivering from cold and fear. My breath came in short, visible bursts, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Everything went silent. And then I saw it. Something tall and impossibly thin standing just beyond the window, still as stone. Its face was white and featureless, its arms unnaturally long, its fingers scraping the glass slowly. Slowly, I ran. I didn't grab anything, not my pack, not my coat. I just bolted out the door and ran through the snow-covered woods in the dark. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, miles away, frostbitten and trembling. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even like going near the woods anymore, because sometimes, even now, on cold nights when the wind is still, I swear I hear that tapping again. And when I look out the window, I feel like something is watching. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a simple winter retreat to clear my mind and escape the chaos of work and city life. I'd rented a small cabin near the edge of a frozen lake, tucked deep in the northern woods. It was isolated, silent, and peaceful, or at least it seemed that way. The first 2 days were everything I hoped for. I spent time reading by the fire, watching the snow fall through the windows, sipping hot coffee while wrapped in blankets. There was no phone service, no internet, just me and nature. It was perfect until the third night. That's when I first noticed the footprints. I had gone outside to grab more firewood, and under the pale light of the moon, I saw them. Bare footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to the side of my cabin. No shoes, no boots, just naked human feet. The strange part? There were only prints heading toward the cabin, none leaving. I stood there for a long time, breath fogging in the freezing air, trying to convince myself they were old, that maybe I hadn't noticed them before. But they looked fresh, edges crisp, the snow still undisturbed around them. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I searched the area around the cabin. No sign of anyone. The footprints had disappeared in the wind and new snowfall, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. That night, I locked every door and window. I pushed a chair against the front door and left a flashlight by my side. But sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud thump on the wall, like a fist slamming against it. I held my breath, listening. Another thump, closer now. Then came the sound of something dragging along the outside of the cabin. Nails? Claws? It was a slow, scraping sound that circled the entire building. I shined the flashlight toward the nearest window, but I couldn't see anything. The fog on the glass from the inside made it hard to tell, but I could have sworn I saw a faint outline, tall, hunched, almost human. It moved out of sight before I could get a good look. In the morning, I found more footprints, this time in a full circle around the cabin. They were smaller than child-sized, and again, there were no prints leading away. I wanted to leave, but the snowstorm had gotten worse overnight. The trail leading out was buried, and my car wouldn't start. I was trapped there until it cleared. That night, it came closer. I woke up to the sound of whispering, faint at first, like wind, but too rhythmic, too intentional. It was coming from just outside the cabin. I tiptoed to the window and pulled the curtain aside, heart pounding. Nothing. Then, I turned toward the back window and I froze. There was a face looking in, not a person, at least not entirely. It had sunken, hollow eyes, pale skin stretched over sharp bones, and a wide, crooked grin. Its hand was pressed flat against the glass, fingers unnaturally long and thin. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. When I looked again, the window was empty. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement through the trees. The whispering came and went, the thumps on the walls returned, and somewhere deep in the woods, I heard laughter, soft, childlike, but hollow, echoing. When the storm finally broke the next day, I didn't even bother packing. I hiked to the road, car abandoned, phone dead. I flagged down the first truck I saw and never looked back. I later found out from a local that the cabin had a dark history. Decades ago, a child had gone missing there, last seen playing near the lake. They said his body was never found. Some believed he'd drowned. Others said something in the woods had taken him. But the strangest part, that child was said to be barefoot. I've never told anyone this story, not because I didn't want to, but because I still can't make sense of it. It happened last March during one of the coldest weeks I can remember. I had just taken a job as a night cleaner at an old mountain resort that was preparing to reopen after years of being shut down. My job was simple: clean the halls, dust the rooms, check for leaks, and keep the place warm until the new staff arrived the following month. The resort was massive, 5 floors, over 100 rooms with long, winding corridors and antique furniture covered in dusty sheets. Most of it had been abandoned for years, and it showed. The first few nights were uneventful. I brought my thermos of coffee, played music on my headphones, and wandered the empty halls with my mop and bucket. But on the fifth night, something changed. It started with room 217. I'd been told to skip that one. Apparently, the door was jammed, and maintenance hadn't fixed it yet. But as I passed by that hallway, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Just a crack, enough to see the light inside flickering like a lamp was on. I paused, confused. No one else was supposed to be here, and there were no lights turned on when I'd walked that floor the night before. I pushed the door gently. It creaked open with a slow groan. The room inside looked untouched, bed still made, furniture draped in white covers. But there was a lamp in the corner, an old one with a yellowed shade, and it was flickering like it had been plugged in. I walked over to unplug it, thinking it was some kind of electrical issue. But when I reached behind it, I realized it wasn't plugged in at all. The cord just dangled, disconnected. The bulb flickered once more, then went out. I left the room quickly and made a mental note to report it. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there with me. Things got worse after that. The next night, I heard a knock. I was on the 3rd floor when it happened. 3 slow knocks coming from room 217 again. I froze, mop still in hand, heart racing. I waited. Nothing followed. Just silence. I tried to brush it off. Maybe an old pipe, a shift in the wood, something explainable. But every night after that, I heard the knocks. And not just from room 217, sometimes from the elevator shaft, sometimes from behind closed doors and empty rooms I hadn't entered. Always slow, always deliberate. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like wind through a crack in the window. But as I walked the halls, I started hearing fragments, words I couldn't make out. Sometimes they sounded like my name. One night, as I passed the ballroom, I heard music playing, soft piano notes echoing through the halls. I peeked inside. The chandelier was swaying, the grand piano's lid was open, keys moving on their own. I backed away slowly, too stunned to move any faster. But the worst night, the night I finally quit, was the night I found the footprints. It had snowed hard, even inside the mountain resort's covered perimeter. Near the front door, I saw wet footprints leading across the marble floor. Bare feet again, small like a child's, but strangely long. I followed them. They trailed into the hallway, turned sharply at room 217, and stopped right in front of the door. And then, the door opened on its own, just a few inches. I don't know what possessed me, but I stepped forward and looked inside. There was someone sitting on the edge of the bed, a small figure facing away from me, hair matted and damp, pale arms dangling by their sides. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. And then slowly, it turned its head toward me. Its face wasn't human anymore. Hollow eyes, skin gray and tight like old leather, mouth stretched wide as a silent scream. I slammed the door shut and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, not even to grab my jacket or my bag. The next morning, I sent in my resignation and never returned. I don't know what was in that resort, what haunted that room, or if it even came from this world. But sometimes in the silence of cold winter nights, I still hear those knocks, 3 slow taps echoing through my memory, and I wonder if whatever was inside that room ever really let me leave. It was the winter after my divorce when I decided to move into the old duplex on the outskirts of town. I needed space, both emotionally and physically, from everything familiar. The place was cheap, quiet, and tucked away behind a dense row of pine trees, barely visible from the main road. The landlord had warned me that the other unit was vacant and had been for a while. I welcomed the solitude. The first week went by uneventfully. I shoveled snow from the narrow path to the door, unpacked my books, and tried to adjust to the silence. The duplex was old, but not falling apart. A few creaks here and there, but nothing unusual for a place built before the 60s. One night, though, I heard footsteps from the other unit. It was around 2 a.m., and I was half asleep on the couch when I heard slow, heavy pacing from the other side of the thin wall. At first, I thought it might be a stray animal or something falling, but the steps were distinct, measured, deliberate, and too human to be anything else. I got up and pressed my ear against the wall. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps. They moved from one end of the room to the other, paused, then returned again. I stared out the frosted window at the other unit. No lights, no signs of life. I called the landlord the next morning. He was confused, insisted the other unit was locked, and even offered to come by to check. He brought the key, opened the door to the empty unit, and walked through it with me. Dust everywhere. No footprints, nothing disturbed. It was cold, freezing cold, colder than my side, even though we shared the same heating system. But that night, the footsteps returned. And not just footsteps. I started hearing tapping, slow, methodical tapping, against the shared wall, as if someone were knocking with their fingernails. Sometimes it was rhythmic, like a pattern or a code. Other times it was frantic and erratic, like someone was trapped and trying to get out. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I moved my mattress to the living room, trying to put distance between myself and that wall. But even there, the sounds followed. Late one night, I heard breathing, deep, raspy breathing coming from the air vent. I turned off everything, TV, heater, fridge, and still, it persisted. Breathing that didn't belong to me. Then, things started to move. Chairs slightly out of place in the morning, cabinet doors left ajar, the shower dripping when I hadn't used it in hours. I started to wonder if maybe I was cracking under the pressure. Loneliness, stress, the cold. But then, I found the message. One morning, written in the fog on the bathroom mirror, were the words, "Don't let it in." I stood frozen in place, staring at those 4 words. I hadn't even showered yet. There was no fog on the mirror or the room. I wiped it away, hoping it was a prank or something explainable. But it happened again the next night. Same message, same mirror, same eerie handwriting. I decided to stay at a friend's place. When I returned to grab more clothes, I noticed something chilling. The footsteps weren't just in the other unit anymore. They were in mine. I could hear them from the hallway as I approached. Not just pacing, but dragging sounds, like something heavy was being pulled across the floor. I opened the door cautiously, heart thudding, ready to run. No one was there, but the mirror in the bathroom had a new message. Too late. That was the last night I stayed in the duplex. I moved out within 48 hours, breaking the lease and never looking back. I don't know what was in that place, if it was something supernatural, something psychological, or something worse. But I still hear tapping sometimes in my new apartment, faint and far off, like it's trying to find me again. And I'll never forget that cold winter night when I realized I wasn't ever really alone in that duplex, not even for a second. It was one of those bitter March nights when the wind screamed through the trees like it had a voice of its own. I was house sitting for my aunt and uncle while they vacationed in Florida, and their place sat on the edge of a rural, snow-blanketed town with nothing but forest stretching out behind it. Cozy on the outside, sure, but once night fell, that house turned into something else entirely. They'd warned me that the power sometimes flickered during storms and that the house made noises because of its age. I wasn't concerned. I figured I'd catch up on some reading and enjoy the quiet. The first night passed without anything unusual, just the creaking of old pipes and the occasional gust of wind. But on the second night, I heard the knocking. It started faint, barely noticeable, like someone tapping their fingers on the glass pane of the back door. I looked, of course. Nothing was there. I chalked it up to tree branches swaying in the storm and went back to reading. But the tapping didn't stop. In fact, it started getting louder, more distinct, more rhythmic. On the third night, I started locking every door and window twice. Something about the knocking didn't feel random anymore. It happened around the same time each night, just after midnight, and always at the back door, the one that faced the forest. I checked every time. Nothing. Just trees and darkness and snow. Then came the footprints. That morning I noticed them. Bare footprints in the snow, leading from the woods to the back door. No shoes, no boots, just bare, human feet. They circled around the house and disappeared back into the... I stared at them, trying to rationalize what... The prints were fresh, perfectly preserved, and no sign of any other tracks, no animal prints, no return trail. Just that one set leading straight to the door and vanishing. I called my aunt and uncle, asked if anyone else had keys or if they'd experienced anything weird before. They sounded confused and slightly concerned, but ultimately brushed it off. Just an animal, my aunt. Probably a fox or something. But foxes don't have feet like that. That night I heard breathing on the other side of the door. Not just tapping it, breathing, shaky and slow, like someone trying not to make a sound. I turned off all the lights and pressed my ear against the wooden frame. It was right there, so close I could feel the vibrations through the door. I didn't open it. I don't know why, maybe instinct, maybe fear, but I didn't move until the sound stopped. The next morning I found something even worse. A handprint on the glass. A long, slender hand. The fingers were oddly long, the palm almost skeletal. But it wasn't just that. It was the streak of red smeared across the glass, like something had dragged their fingers down while watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, eyes fixed on the back door, waiting for something, anything, to explain what was happening. At exactly midnight, the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't outside. It came from inside the house. 3 sharp knocks on the door leading to the basement. I froze. I hadn't even been down there yet. The door had stayed locked, the lights off, but now It was rattling gently, like something on the other side was waiting for me to come closer. I stood up, every instinct screaming to run, but my legs moved anyway. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and placed my hand on the doorknob. Something whispered my name from the other side. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed my bag, ran out into the snow, and didn't stop until I was halfway to town. I stayed with a friend the rest of the week and refused to go back to that house until my aunt and uncle returned. They asked what happened when they got home. I told them everything. They didn't laugh. Instead, my uncle went quiet, then said something I'll never forget. That's why we don't stay here in the winter. He never explained further, and I never went back. It was a quiet, desolate March evening when I took the temporary night shift at the local community library. The regular clerk had taken a sudden leave, and I needed the extra money, so I agreed without hesitation. The building was old, built in the early 1900s, and stood just off a snow-covered road surrounded by dense, leafless trees. During the day, it had a quaint, almost charming atmosphere, but at night, that charm dissolved into something cold and oppressive. My shift started at 6 p.m. and ran until midnight. Most nights were uneventful, just the occasional late student, an elderly patron picking up mystery novels, or someone using the computer station in the back. But that particular Tuesday night, something was different. It started with the lights. Around 9 p.m., the overhead bulbs in the history section began to flicker. Not unusual for an old building, but these didn't just flicker. They pulsed, almost like they were reacting to something. I walked over to check the switches, but before I got there, the lights went out entirely. Just that one section. The rest of the library stayed lit. I stood there, staring into the aisle of darkness, waiting for the motion sensor to kick back in. Then, I saw movement in the dark. Just a silhouette, tall, lanky, unmoving. I called out, thinking someone might be browsing and didn't want to be startled. But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, deep in the shadows between the shelves. I stepped forward, cautiously, flashlight in hand, and when the beam finally illuminated the aisle, there was no one there, just books and dust. I convinced myself it was a trick of the eye. Shadows, stress, maybe a coat rack or reflection from outside. I tried to shake it off and return to the front desk, but the feeling didn't go away. The silence grew thicker, like the air had weight. Even the heating vents, which usually rattled and hummed, had gone completely quiet. That's when the books started falling, one by one from random shelves across different sections, always just one at a time, spaced minutes apart. I'd go pick one up, reshelve it, and then hear another thud echo from somewhere else. It wasn't just falling, it was deliberate, like something wanted me to move, to walk deeper into the building, to follow. Eventually, I stopped picking them up. I stayed behind the desk, staring at the security monitor. One by one, the cameras began glitching out, static, then black. It started with the rare book room, then the back hallway, then the archives. All that remained was the camera pointed directly at the front entrance, and then I noticed something. On the screen, I saw the front doors slowly creak open, but I hadn't heard anything. I looked up. The doors were closed, still locked. I looked back at the screen and saw someone standing just inside the doorway. A figure wearing a long, old-fashioned coat, face obscured by shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I looked again in real life. Still no one there. But on the monitor, the figure was slowly walking inside, toward me. I backed away from the desk, eyes darting between the screen and the empty air in front of me. The figure was closer now on the monitor, passing shelves, stepping quietly, getting nearer. I should have run. I should have bolted right then and there. But something kept me frozen. The figure reached the front desk on the monitor. I felt cold air wrap around me, and then nothing. The monitor went black. I grabbed my bag, turned off the lights, and ran outside into the snow without looking back. I didn't even bother locking up. I just drove home, heart pounding, hands shaking on the wheel. The next day, I called in and quit the job. I didn't care about the money anymore. But that night, as I was drifting off to sleep in my apartment, I heard the sound of books falling. Just one, then another. And from the hallway outside my door, the soft, deliberate creak of old wooden floors. I hadn't brought any books home. At least, I thought I hadn't. It was the final stretch of winter, that strange limbo in March when the snow clings to the earth, but the air carries a hint of something changing. I'd gone to stay in my family's old lakeside cabin for a weekend retreat, just to disconnect, clear my head, and escape the stress of my city life. The cabin had been in our family for decades, but no one had stayed there in years. Still, I remembered it fondly from childhood. Hot cocoa by the fire, ice skating on the frozen lake, my grandfather's stories told in a low voice beneath flickering lantern light. But this time, it didn't feel the same. I arrived just before dusk. Snow had drifted up the sides of the cabin, and the air was bitter cold. The place smelled of aged wood and damp stone. I lit the fireplace, unpacked, and tried to shake the eerie feeling that settled in my chest the moment I stepped inside. Maybe it was just the silence. There's something different about being truly alone. No neighbors, no traffic, just the wind howling across a frozen lake. That first night, I noticed the footsteps. They weren't mine. I'd only walked in once to bring my things in, but when I stepped outside to bring in firewood, I saw other tracks, bare footprints in the snow, long, narrow, leading from the tree line down toward the back of the cabin. At first, I told myself it must have been some animal, maybe a weird deer track, distorted by the wind. But they were unmistakably human, and they weren't there when I arrived. That night, the cabin groaned more than usual. The old boards creaked under invisible weight, like someone was walking just above me in the attic. But the attic was empty, just an old trunk, some dusty furniture, and silence. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping sound. It was faint, like fingertips brushing the glass window beside my bed. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding. Nothing was there, just frost and darkness. The next morning, I found something. On the front porch, half buried in snow, was a small hand-carved wooden figure. A little man with long limbs, a twisted smile, and hollow eyes. I hadn't brought it. No one else was supposed to be up there. It looked old, but somehow freshly placed. I threw it into the woods. But the next night, it returned, sitting on the windowsill, this time with a small, jagged crack down the middle of its face. The tapping started again, louder, more deliberate. Not just on the bedroom window anymore, but all around the cabin, on the back door, the kitchen window, even the attic floor above me. I wanted to leave, to pack up and drive home, but a snowstorm had rolled in. Roads were closed. I was stuck. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing movement outside, then inside. I checked the locks repeatedly, even pushed furniture against the door. But by 2 a.m., I heard the attic stairs creak, one step at a time. Something or someone was coming down. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood in the corner of the room, staring at the door. It never opened, but the sound didn't stop. Heavy steps moving slowly through the hall. I turned on every light in the cabin, hoping it would scare whatever it was off, but it didn't. In the morning, I found a second wooden figure on the kitchen table. This one was cracked completely down the middle with deep burn marks on its body, as if it had been in the fire. I didn't put it there. I didn't even try to rationalize it. The moment the road was clear enough, I packed everything, drove away, and never looked back. Weeks later, I got a call from my cousin. He'd gone up to the cabin to check on some repairs. He sounded off, shaken. There were footprints all over the porch, and this thing on the table, a weird wooden doll. Did you leave that there? I told him no, that I'd burned it. He was silent for a moment before whispering, "Then how is it still here?" I haven't returned since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear soft tapping on my apartment window. Tapping that comes from 20 stories up, with nothing outside but air and sky.